Good, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar on Artists as Workers, the latest report of the survey of professional artists that has been produced by the formidable Professor David Throsby and Katya Petetskaya, the Research Director at Macquarie University, in partnership with the research team at Creative Australia, led by our Research Director, Rebecca Mostyn, and Research Program Manager, Anita Strezova. I'd like to start by acknowledging the many countries that we are dialing in from this afternoon. I'm joining from Darkinjung land on the central coast of New South Wales, and many of my colleagues are joining from Gadigal land in Sydney. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians of these places and the elders of those communities, and First Nations colleagues who may be with us today. And of course, the elders of the many sites across Australia that you're all dialing in from. So we have 30 minutes together in this webinar this afternoon and a lot to cover. We will leave time for questions at the end, so please start thinking about what you'd like to ask our eminent researchers and drop your questions in the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window. We do have 300 participants registered for this webinar this afternoon, so please be patient with us. We may not get to everyone's questions, but we will do our best. I'd also like to welcome our Auslan interpreters, Jody and Tiana, who you'll see interpreting for us on the screen, and thank them for their support this afternoon. So, as many of you will know, this is a major longitudinal study that's been running for 40 years now. It gives us some really vital long-term trends and timely insights about the dynamics affecting creative work in this country and Australian artists as workers, as we've titled this report. It tells us how they're developing their skills through training, the time they are able to dedicate to their creative work, and where and how they're earning incomes. This last study was conducted at the tail end of the COVID disruptions and on the eve of our new national cultural policy. In a way, it gives us quite a detailed picture of some of the problems we are trying to solve in the sector. It's, of course, a really vital evidence base for us at Creative Australia that informs our thinking, policy and programs. In fact, I've already quoted it 4 times in our executive meeting this morning, so it's going to keep informing us as we develop our responses to what artists need in Australia today. There are 2 reports being released today. The first one is the main report the Macquarie University produces, which is quite a magnum opus. It's 268 pages. And Creative Australia's companion summary report, which is 45 pages long, and an interactive dashboard that represents the data in a range of dynamic ways that you can look up, all available on the Creative Australia website. So, of course, looking at these trends over time enables us to identify some of the systemic and structural challenges supporting creative careers in Australia. And we've been saying that, of course, read alongside our other research at Creative Australia, it's evident that at precisely the same moment that Australians are starting to recognise the value of the creative work that is being produced by the sector in new ways, we are seeing the ongoing struggle of artists to find time to dedicate to generating that value through their creative work and to maintain enough of a living income to support it. So I'd like to start engaging with the authors of this report now. David, if I may start with you, can you give us some insights into how you conduct the study and how the survey is constructed?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Geordie. It's as you said, it's a survey which has been going back now 40 years. I did the first one in 1983 because there was an inquiry into the situation of the individual artist, and the situation then was pretty much as it is now, that the individual artists are the main producers of art and culture in this country, and they stand in the middle of the arts and they stand in the middle of the creative industries, and they're a major sort of generator of ideas and output. And yet we don't really know much, or we didn't really know much then, about how they work, what their incomes were, what the time they would spend on various things, what the constraints were on their work. And ever since then, the surveys have been concerned with this. And so, as you said, we have a long series of data now. Every 5 or 6 or 7 years, we've been redoing these surveys, and the most recent one has just been published. So it is a survey, and it's also important to say that it's a survey of practicing professional artists. It's about not about sort of people who just do art for enjoyment on the side. These are professionals who have had long periods of training, experience, and so on. And so they're professional workers in a very real sense. The surveys are by invitation, rather than just any old person who wants to be an artist can opt in. They're by invitation, so that we have a sample which is statistically valid for inference to the whole population of artists, and that's subject to all the sort of statistical criteria that are required. And so we have, in the surveys, we have different numbers. This time we had about 630 artists were involved, and it covers all the art forms, of course: writers, visual artists, actors, dancers, musicians, composers, everybody. And we have about 450 who do who fill in the income forms. The income part of the survey is a separate part, which is administered by personal invitation. By personal interview, because that's very sensitive data. People don't like to talk about their incomes, but we do have established a very good relationship with the artists, and so we get very good data on incomes, and so the data that we have on incomes is pretty reliable.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. And so what does it tell us in the terms of the 40 years you've been looking at it? You mentioned that the questions we're grappling with are the same as they were in the 80s. What does it tell us about what it is to be an artist as worker in Australia?
It paints a picture of professionals who can't work full-time at their artistic work. And this is something which has always been true. And in fact, what we found over the years, we always look at the way in which artists work under three sort of headings. One is the creative work they do, producing original output. The other is arts-related work, which they do to use their creative skills, but isn't producing output, like teaching. That's the most obvious one. And then there's non-arts work when they work outside. And we found the proportions of those over the years have remained pretty stable, which is a sort of indication that in some ways nothing much changes. And the relativity of their incomes also stays pretty much the same. And that is that the creative income is never enough to, except for a very few artists, to support full-time work. And so the incentive or the requirement there is to work outside, not just to meet the the business of staying alive, but also to support and sustain their actual artistic practice, which is what artists do. So we find that over the long period of time, these are the things which remain reasonably stable. Some other things have changed over time. The number of artists has fluctuated a bit. It grew very fast in the early periods, but then it's been declining a little bit more recently. And other things like that, we do get a long-term picture, and this can be seen from the data which you can access through the website.
And we're seeing a trend, aren't we, in this survey towards more precarious work in all of those fields, aren't we? That kind of the nature of the work in all of those domains, the kind of core arts practice, but also the other forms of work that people might kind of engage in to support their creative practice or have that kind of fuller income suite. They're all becoming a little more precarious. Is that right?
Indeed, yes, indeed. And in fact, one of the things which is also clear from our data over this long period of time is that more and more artists are having to become freelance. In the early days of the survey, there were a much larger proportion of artists had full-time employment as artists, and that is a much smaller proportion now. And so the number of freelancers and self-employed people as artists, it's been sort of more or less, this is rather similar to what's happened in the rest of the economy. As we know, the casualisation of the workforce in the economy at large has been going on over this time as well. But artists are particularly hard hit, I think, by this sort of thing. And so they do have more precarious working conditions. And that's something which I think policy and other forms of intervention have to try to address.
Absolutely. They're the original gig workers, right?
Yes, yes, indeed. The original, and in fact, the ways in which they have developed their what we call their portfolio careers has been, in a way, a sort of leading example to workers in other industries, and this has been true all over the world. That artists, as portfolio career holders, these have sort of shown the way to in many occupations all around the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. Katya, if I might turn to you. So this survey was conducted at a particular moment in time, as we were saying in the intro. It's kind of coming out of COVID. It's kind of, as we were grappling with some pretty radical disruptions. What do the insights this time tell us about this particular moment in time?
Well, every time we conduct a survey, we always try to integrate the feedback we received during the previous one. So in the previous survey, we had some feedback that artists wanted to, there was a certain issue the survey didn't cover. And in this survey in particular, we focused on, we spent we have significantly more data about labor that is unpaid labor, not only in the arts, but also arts related and non-arts work. We also focus on donations, that artists, the fact that artists also donate their time and work. And it's about, we now have figures, how much artists donate, how much time they spend doing work for free outside of their arts. And of course, we looked at the COVID because it was not possible not to look at COVID impact. And at the time of the survey in 2022, we found that only a third of artists in Australia were able to come back to work as usual, and 16% said that it was never probably able to come back. So that was very sad data. That's comparing to our trends data that David mentioned about artist population, which in comparison, so as David mentioned, the increase in the 80s, so we're talking about come the 90s, and then we have the same number, about 45,000 artists in Australia, which is comparing to labor force figures, which almost doubled when the survey started in 1980s. And Australian populations coming from overall Australian population coming from 16,000 to 26,000 in 2022, we are losing artists. So it's the share of artists in Australian labor force and in Australian population is shrinking fast. And so if there are very few of them now out there in comparison to the previous years. So yeah,
that is really distressing, isn't it? So a lot of us, I think, were very concerned that might be the case during COVID, and we're actually now seeing it in the data. Yeah, interesting. Gosh, that's really, really edifying. That's really kind of concerning, isn't it? I guess to both of you, did anything, and I might start with you, David, did anything particularly surprise or challenge you out of these findings that you saw in this version that you hadn't anticipated, having looked at the data for so long?
Yeah, I think that, well, it's strange, because I think in one respect you could say that it's surprising that COVID didn't have a bigger effect. I mean, COVID really did have a major effect, and all the theatres were closed and the musicians couldn't get work, but it did also mean that some artists were able to work online and work on their own, particularly writers and others like that. But so I think the fact that artists are starting to come back is very reassuring, but they're not there, as Katya was just saying, we're not there yet by any means. And most only said, I mean, the majority just said, well, look, we're getting there, but we're not there yet. And 16% said, no, we're not going to be able to get back. So there is a loss of artistic talent, and that relative to the labour force at large is a concern. And I think that that's something which we need to look at. I would be expecting, I think, that it would start to pick up again once the final effects of COVID work themselves through. But that's a longer term process, and so we never know where it is going to finish up.
And I've had a question come through on the Q&A, if we can, and this might not be something you can answer from the data, David, but perhaps if you could address it. Why are we losing artists? Do we have a sense of the main causes? I mean, obviously you're looking at those challenges in terms of remuneration and the dynamics and the barriers. Do you have a sense that you can kind of interpret from what we're seeing?
I think the only thing you could probably say would be the sort of precariousness of the profession when you consider it with other things that artists can do, and the sorts of much higher incomes that people can get. So people on the fringes, I don't like to use that word, but people who are not quite so sort of persuaded that they want to be artists, then they may decide not to take up a career. But one thing we do find, of course, is that artists are totally committed. The artists who are there are totally committed to their career. And they do it because they see it's important, and I think the society as a whole has to see that too, that what artists do is important from the point of view of society as a whole, and that's something which we have to celebrate and we have to try and encourage. But as to the deterrence and why there is this sort of decline, it's a little bit difficult to put your finger on a single cause. I think it's a sort of multiple causes are sort of having an impact here.
We actually, to your question, Georgie, well, one of the things that also shocked us, David and I, in this survey was very high expenses of making art. The proportions of expenses and incomes have been increasing. And in this survey, we found that it was 3/4 of their income artists put back into their art production.
Oh, it's extraordinary.
So, coupled with this like very low incomes already, and we are talking about the average incomes, the median income that basically divides artist population is even lower. It's 11,000. So 11,000 is the figure when half of the artists are above 11,000 and half below 11,000. So
and cost of production with the average cost.
And the cost production is 3/4 of what they earn. So through art. So it is, artists are dedicated. This year we also introduced questions why artists, motivation questions, why artists choose to make art. Some of the highest scores is that the artistic excellence comes first to them. These also artists who are not desperate in terms of choice of their educational levels are very high, much higher than the general labor force, higher than professionals in Australia. Wow. Like there are 40% of artists who have graduate or postgraduate degree comparing to 30% of other professionals. So they are highly educated. So you'd think they know what they're doing.
Yeah. So this is a highly educated cohort, highly skilled cohort that do have other options. Yeah. So it really genuinely is a labour of love, right? It's it's very motivated by the excellent, as you said, that kind of the quality of the production, the work that they're making, and they're investing a lot of their own time and often money in achieving that, I guess. Yeah. Katya, was there anything else that surprised you in this iteration that was kind of new to the dynamics in the sector that you would like to highlight?
Well, Georgie, you mentioned the word investing, and I think surprising was that artists spend about 78% of Australian artists also put their savings into making their art. Imagine the amount of belief and in their work and significance of their work that people have to continue. It's very admirable, and as I said, artistic excellence comes first. That is for sure. Yes. Another thing was quite incredible that about 90% of Australian artists also continue their education.
Wow. I mean, that's an stunning figure, isn't it? 89% or 90% kind of engaged in lifelong learning. That is just such a sign of, ongoing optimism, I guess, in the face of these other dynamics. Yeah.
Cultural capital is, sorry, I have to say, cultural capital is high. It's just, I think they probably need some little more support.
Yes, other forms of capital would help too, right? Yeah, indeed. So we've had a question come through on the chat, and please, everybody who are dialing in, please start to send us your questions. We really value them. So, we were anticipating we might receive a question on gender. This is not the one that I anticipated would get, but it's an interesting one. Why are male artists a dwindling demographic group, since it's now only 35% of artists? Because we've seen the increase now to 65% of the artists identified in the survey as identifying as female. Why do we see a shrinking cohort potentially, or is it just that women are kind of joining the creative workforce at high numbers?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I'll let Katya answer this too, but I would certainly say that it's not so much that the numbers of male artists are dwindling, it's just that relative to the proportions of female artists that are growing, and so that's or the numbers of female artists are growing. So I think that's sort of one of the reasons, and it may also be some reflection on the fact that it may be somewhat easier now for women to get into the workforce, the artistic workforce. I don't know whether that's, I mean, one could only say that as sort of anecdotal evidence rather than anything that comes particularly from the survey. And all we can really do in terms of evidence is to compare the data. And that does seem to suggest that the numbers of male artists proportionately is declining. And beyond that, I don't think that there's a great deal that one can say. I don't think there isn't anything particularly in our data which would point to that.
Except for the counterintuitive finding that the pay gap for female artists is greater than it is for the rest of the workforce, right? So
yes,
you'd think in terms
that is very encouraging for women artists that the pay gap is declining, diminishing. It's still there, and the work that we've done ourselves on trying to get more detail and more analytical understanding of the gender pay gap. We always finish up with something which we can't explain, and this is the same for the workforce at large. The gender pay gap can't be explained other than on the basis of some sort of continuing discrimination which is in there, and it seems to be declining, seems to be disappearing, but it hasn't by any means disappeared yet.
No, indeed. And obviously some big conversations around this in Australia at the moment around those systemic and structural issues that are culture. Yeah.
We also have insights now in the census data, for example, and in census data, there are artists and female and male artists, the figures are different. So the share is almost the same. But we also know from our questions into the census, for example, that female artists are less likely to report themselves as artists than men.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, so that's also one of their why we suddenly have like because the procedure of the survey changed slightly, and we do use census figure adjusted for that knowledge that we receive from the survey.
Indeed. I've got a question here that's a detailed question about how we might be losing artists. So it says here, if the survey finds that we are losing professional artists, but participation, at least in music, the stat that the question is familiar with, is pretty stable, are there any indications that either A, people are pursuing truly non-professional paths, or B, people are working at a high level but almost entirely earning their income outside their arts practice? Would they then fall outside the definition of professional in this survey?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, the definition of professional doesn't have anything particularly to do with income. It has to do with working at a standard of practice, which is comparable with or acceptable with the high, the standards of the profession that they're working in. And so that's something which would be, I'm sorry, but to know my phone. I think that we could say that artists are they do find it difficult to continue, and so I'll see. Katya might have an answer to this question.
Well, actually, we don't really know why artists. I think this is I think it would be
from the data, of course. Yeah, I mean, we hear from stakeholders that message about precarity in the sector has actually started to have an impact, right? So that there's less appetite, there's less demand because people are concerned.
Sorry, Georgia. I think one thing to say though that I was going to say before this is that there is a sort of increasing appreciation of the arts in the community, and that's something which comes through in the arts participation surveys. That people are gradually coming to realise that artists are, the artwork that artists produce, whether it's musicians or visual artists or writers or whatever, that work is valuable and that they want to be involved in it. And so there's some sort of hope, I guess, in the sense that if that's true, then that underpins to some extent the economic return that artists can get from their artistic work, and that may be something which we hope will continue as the demand for art continues to rise, and we'll probably be seeing this in future arts participation surveys.
Fantastic, thanks, David. We've got a question here about the numbers of disabled artists. So obviously in this latest iteration, we've seen the number of artists who identify as living with a disability doubling. Someone's asking why we think that's the case and what else we know about disabled artists from this study. I think there was some sort of findings there about unemployment and ongoing barriers to creative work.
Yeah, we find that the effect of having a disability will vary between different artists. Some find it is constantly affecting their artistic practice, and some find it doesn't affect it at all. The majority find that it has some effects, and that's understandable. And whether or not, and that's generally a negative effect, of course, on their artistic practice. One thing which we did find was that artists with disability are more subject to unemployment and have had longer periods of unemployment than other artists in the period that we've studied. And that's also of concern. I think that some of the support measures which are now perhaps stronger for the disability community will be flowing through to artists. And so there may be some optimism in the future that these sorts of support measures may be stronger and help artists with disability to be able to practice their art without the negative impacts that that some of them have experienced.
Excellent, thanks, David. We've got another question here that we've got actually a couple of questions that go to the issue of the definition of artist. So there was a question here about whether arts workers, the survey captures arts workers, and what kind of categories around community and cultural development might kind of fit around. So my understanding was there were 4 criteria. One was around having studied creative practice, a recognised substantial body of work, having presented or performed in the last 3 to 5 years, or having received a grant. Is that right? Are they the kind of 4 categories? Yeah. So I guess that kind of speaks to that. It's actually artists themselves. It's not the broader community of arts workers. Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, people might define themselves as arts workers if they happen to, say, work in an art gallery or something like that without being artists themselves. So we're talking here about people who actually do have creative output, who produce creative work themselves. And of course, many of those are art workers as well. I mean, we find that a number of artists do take jobs as, and that's the arts-related work which we talk about in the labour categories. The creative work is just simply producing original output, but the arts-related work is anything which has to do with the arts, like an arts worker, but isn't producing creative output. And as I said before, one of the most important dimensions of that is teaching. Most artists will, or the great majority of artists will engage in teaching and other forms of using their artistic skills and teaching students. But the criteria are all to do with professional standards, and no single one is sufficient to define an artist. But once you take them together, they add up to a view or a picture of somebody who is committed to their art, who is practicing, and who has achieved or is achieving the level of or the standard of work which is acceptable in their own profession. So if you talk about an actor, an actor who has had a professional part in a play with a professional or a musical or whatever with a professional company, then that may be sufficient to justify that person as an artist at that standard. And if you're a novelist and you've had a novel published by a recognized publisher, then that's the same sort of, these are the sorts of criteria that we use.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. And I think it goes back to your point earlier about being generators of ideas and standing in the middle of that ecosystem, but being part of a bigger ecosystem. That's great. We've had a couple of questions about whether the survey tells us anything about the well-being of artists. I mean, obviously, we're all in the cost of living crisis, and artists are earning far less than the rest of the workforce. Is there anything that you could sort of comment on in that space, David or Katya?
Yeah, we do. Oh, Katya, you might like to answer this. We do have questions about well-being, and we find.
Yeah, we have a question of well-being continuously throughout the surveys, and this year it was about around 7, which is comparable with Australian population, the well-being. So they're not particularly better or particularly worse than the rest of Australians.
So it's you can't look to that as sort of suggesting that if you want to feel better off, become an artist. It's not quite like that.
Or worse off, for that matter.
Or worse off, yeah. No, it's that. I mean, as we know, Australian as a whole, this is part of the problem of getting well-being questions, because part of the well-being comes from just living in this country, and that's why we compare with other people in this country. And one of the things about Australia compared to other countries is that we're pretty well off when it comes to well-being. And the standard well-being question is, as we know, to what extent are you satisfied with your life as it is at present? And we're all reasonably satisfied, particularly so compared to other countries, and that's true for artists as well.
I guess it shows a level of resilience amongst our artists, right? They're continuing to kind of,
Well, I suppose that's right.
Keep that labour of love going in the context.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. If you might be worried if the artists had much lower levels of well-being than the rest of the community, but we don't find that.
I think we should do a survey about the number of optimists. The share of optimism among Australian artists is probably going to be high.
Yeah, Wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Katya. We're actually at time, and David, of course. I mean, wonderful to have your extraordinary insights onto this. And as I said, it gives us such an incredible resource that we continue to draw on for years to come. For those of us who have been joining us online, I'd like to invite you all to join us for a further discussion at 2 p.m. on Thursday, the 16th of May, where we'll be digging deeper into some of the findings of this research with David and Katya, along with some other guests, and we can dive into some of the questions we didn't get to today around issues of IP and AI and issues of diversity in the sector, and we'd really like to invite you all to join us back again. Thank you to our fabulous guests, David and Katya, and of course to our interpreters, Jodie and Tiana, and to all of us who've joined us today. We really welcome your engagement in this very important research. Thanks
and
so
we
much.
also
Go on,
we also wanted to thank like 637 artists who actually,
of course, yeah,
Yes,
the
of
artists who
course.
dedicated their
Survey
time to sharing their insights with us.
shared their story with us. Thank you.
Absolutely,
absolutely.
Thank you, Katya. Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody. See you all later.